Chris has already alluded to what's coming next, and it's a subject matter that has been well publicised by the Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia, if you've been reading the Australian media of late, and it concerns the new payments platform. We're very lucky to have an address by Paul Lahiff. Paul is here in his capacity as the chair of the new payments platform steering committee, and he's going to talk to us about how the new payments platform will meet the needs and expectations of customers in Australia. Paul, over to you.
Before I start, 1:30 on day 2 of a conference is probably a rather hellish position to be in. So what I'm going to get you to do is stand up. Everybody stand up. Please stand up. And whenever I travel somewhere other than Australia, I always like to get a bit of a sense of what the pulse feels like. So what I'd like you to do, firstly the task that I'm going to set you. My understanding is that sometime within the next 12 months, New Zealanders will be asked whether they want to change the flag. And if they do want to change the flag, do they want to go to Mr. Key's preferred option, which is the silver fern? So turn to the person next to you and indicate whether you would vote yes to A, and if you did vote yes to A, would you go then to the silver fern option? Start talking. Come on, quick. It's only a few minutes. It's only a few minutes. Would you vote for a new flag? And if it is a new flag, will you get rid of the Union Jack and put a silver fern there? Okay. That's about it. Okay, you don't need to do the referendum now. This is just a very quick pulse check. Okay, if you said yes, you wanted to change the flag, put up your hand now. I think that's a majority. And if you're in that category, do you want to go for the silver fern? Okay, that's probably 50-50, all right. We'll wait with interest. Sometime next year, isn't it, Dean? Sometime in the next 12 months. Anyway, that's just a little bit to get the blood that's digesting your lunch up here where it should be engaged in what we're talking about. So, firstly, I'd like to say I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I think it's been a great conference. Secondly, I'm about to describe to you what I regard as a transformational project. Now, transformational gets thrown around a lot. It's probably been a bit debased in terms of its currency. But I think this program that we're about to talk to you about today clearly has that dimension. It is a journey, and we're only part of the way along that journey, and I'll describe the journey to you. And therefore, I come to you today with zero hubris and maximum humility about that journey, and to share some of the lessons that perhaps we've learnt thus far. Thirdly, it will build, the presentation very much build upon Chris's platform that has been created. And I'm delighted to work with such a professional as Chris, and I think generally he'd be regarded as one of the fathers of NPP in Australia. Okay, my disclaimer isn't as large as Robert's, but the views that I'm expressing today are my views, and representing 17 organisations is quite a challenge, and therefore I don't speak on any of those behalf, but clearly from my own perspective. So, what's the bill of fare for today's presentation? Firstly, immediate payments. What's all the fuss about? Why are we engaged in this process? Why are we taking so much time and effort and resource to do it? Secondly, if the payment system isn't broken, why are we mucking around with it? Thirdly, what is different about our approach to other fast payment systems around the world? Fourthly, what can we expect from a successful program? And fifth, I haven't put up there, but I thought I'd share some lessons about the experiences that we've had to date. So, real-time payments is not something new. The Japanese first initiated it in 1973. I think they're up to their 11th generation of fast payments, but you can see the UK there, you can see Denmark, you can see Switzerland, Poland, over in the Americas, Mexico and Brazil, and Chile. We've got Nigeria and South Africa, India, Turkey and Japan. More recently, Singapore went live with what they call G3 in March of this year. And we are moving toward, it may not be late 16, it might be early 17, but around that time frame in Australia. Now, I think one of the common themes that have come out today is that there are a range of pressures and influences that are working upon real-time payments. And the first one clearly is regulatory pressures. And this is a quote from the Payment System Board that Chris referred to, which works under the auspices of the Reserve Bank. And they said in their report, market forces might not be sufficient to produce some types of innovation that are in the public interest. And innovation is important to the board's regulatory mandate. Very clear. Now, the Reserve Bank and the Payment System Board initiated a strategic review of innovation in 2012, and a large part of what we're engaged in now with the new payments platform can be traced back to that genesis. And the second quote from the regulators is from the Fed in the States when they said, the challenge for the industry is to provide a payment system for the future that combines the valued attributes of legacy payment methods with new technology. So clearly regulatory pressure is a major influence upon this. And the Fed initiated a major global study of this area in the last 12 months or so. And it's interesting to look at their key takeaways, and I'd like to draw your attention to the first, which is that the decision to launch a faster payment system was always strategic, not financial, as there was no explicit business case. So when you build infrastructure, you have to almost accept that there will be a national good, and then you have to determine what individual or commercial good might flow from that. It's a bit like building a bridge between two towns. You're never quite sure how much traffic it's going to get until you build it. But inevitably, there's probably more traffic than what you ever thought in any initial business case. The fourth point, I think, is a good point, and that is that permitting payment service providers to create new services surrounding the new platform helps facilitate adoption. And that's very much central to what we've done in our design, in that we haven't tried to load up the infrastructure in the middle with all of the competition and innovation and dynamism that we expect to happen. And I'll talk about that. Chris mentioned the term overlay services. And the final point, which has been a critical one with NPP, is stakeholder engagement is absolutely critical. Getting those parties around a table to affect a common good is absolutely vital to any successful outcome. Now, in Australia, we did some serious thinking about this, or I wasn't part of it then, but some very heavy thinkers started to think about this, and there were two key assumptions which arose. Firstly, there will be a wide diversity of user need for real-time payments. The needs of particular communities and particular contexts are becoming more bespoke and tailored, and automated and remote. And secondly, payment systems, schemes and services will themselves become more diverse and more competitive over time. Payment systems and schemes are becoming more commercial and competitively oriented. So that's the first lot of pressures, the regulatory pressures that I've just described. The second lot of pressures have been very well covered today by Simon and Robert, and more recently Chris, and that is consumers are looking to their own device with an open platform and being able to do just about anything on that platform, whether it's music or paying or buying or whatever. That is becoming more and more. Now, I think when Steve first publicised this conference, he said that sometimes consumers, customers, businesses don't always know exactly what they want, but they do know they want it to be fast, easy and secure. And at the end of the day, if it meets those three criteria, it's going to go a long way to getting the type of acceptance from whatever the customer base is, whether it's consumers or businesses or government. The next one Chris had in his presentation, so I'll move fairly quickly through that, and that is the threat of substitutes and new entrants is the third set of factors, which are market pressures. So regulatory pressures, consumer pressures, and thirdly, market forces. So this seems to be developing a tsunami, and it's not just one of those factors, it's the combination of all three that has been one of the drivers behind what we've been trying to do in terms of NPP. And just similarly on that theme, if I pose the question to you, you go onto Amazon and you tap in the word strategy. How many books do you think you can buy? Offer? 5,000? 72,618. This morning. Now, I'd suggest a good number of them are pretty useless because strategy is really about where are you now, where do you want to go, how are you going to get there. That doesn't write a book though, so I'm never going to make money out of that. However, one of the more reputed strategists is Michael Porter. And Michael Porter says there are 3 areas for a business to compete and 1 to cooperate. And the ones that he competes on are operational effectiveness, product innovation, and repositioning. The reshaping, which is largely what we're talking about with new payments platform, falls into that collaborative endeavour. And it wouldn't happen if it didn't have that collaborative endeavour. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So what is the objective of NPP? It's to provide fast, flexible, data-rich payments infrastructure. And Dean alluded to recent comments by Governor Glenn Stevens of the Reserve Bank. And from that speech, I quote him. He said, "We, the industry and the Reserve Bank itself, are building a piece of national infrastructure. We should take every opportunity to increase its potential value to the nation rather than limiting it for fear of where it might take us. The biggest risk with this project is probably not a technical one. It is the risk that in 10 to 15 years' time, we will look back and see that we missed an important opportunity to provide something that will fully and efficiently support the payment needs of our economy. We owe our citizens a better outcome than that. We have to deliver one way or another the architecture and products that they will need into the future," unquote. So what, in very simple terms, is NPP? It's basically a mechanism to allow payer and payee and their financial institutions to effect real-time settlement. So you can see in the middle there, we call it the basic infrastructure, and that was no accident. It's basic because it's designed that way. That has 2 benefits. 1, it will allow competition around the outside, and 2, hopefully it'll mean that the cost of building it won't be such that we get sticker shock. There's probably some element of that, but our endeavour is to make that basic. The overlay services at the top are a bit like going to an app store and buying a particular app, and that's where we expect financial institutions to really engage in massive competition around that, depending upon what their customer base is. Some obviously will have a very strong retail presence and be looking for apps that satisfy their consumer base. Others will have an SME type orientation. Others will have a very strong focus on government. Others will have a very significant orientation toward large corporates. Down the bottom, a very critical part, and not only do we appreciate the Governor's words of support, but the RBA itself has to go through a significant amount of change to be ready for this, because at the end of the day, exchange settlement accounts need to be settled off, and therefore they're having to invest significant amounts of money in what they're calling fast settlement services to be ready for this to be operative. So the Reserve Bank is a participant, it will be a provider, and very clearly has a very strong interest in seeing this work from a public policy perspective. Why do it this way? 3 aspects. Firstly, it needs to be versatile. Providers need to serve all, anytime, person to person, business to business, government to person. Secondly, in the era of the cloud, customer expectations are for real-time service, and that must be built in. And thirdly, data richness is critical, particularly in relation to businesses and perhaps both small and medium-sized businesses and also corporates. As economic activity goes fully digital, the payment must be embedded in the transaction. So let me drill down a little bit more into the 2 basic aspects of what we're about. The basic infrastructure will be a ubiquitous open network. 17 organisations that have come this far, and however many move into the next phase, which I expect to be a significant number of that 17, will have some degree of first mover advantage, but it won't be a closed shop. It has to be open, it has to be competitive, it has to be available and accessible by any organisation that is able to come up to scratch in terms of the requirements. Secondly, very importantly, the message format provides a lot of that data richness that we spoke about. So ISO 20022 is a global standard which is part of the exercise. Fast ADI to ADI, approved depository institution to approved depository institution turnaround. As Chris said, this is a new platform. This isn't a replacement for anything that's currently there. And finally, real-time value delivery will occur through the Reserve Bank and that fast settlement services that I described before. The second element of our architecture is the overlay area, which, as I say, is a bit like an app store. It will use the infrastructure, but this will be a commercial entity. The basic infrastructure will be run as a mutual company owned by the industry and not there to make major profits. Basically, to fund itself is the requirement we're looking for. It will be varied and potentially competitive. Payment providers must belong to the infrastructure before they can provide an overlay service, but they can choose which overlays to use. And it will provide could provide extra tailored data to link payment with transaction. Now, I've been very careful to describe that we're not picking winners in this apps place. However, there is one exception. And we're calling that our initial convenience service, which will be the first overlay using the basic infrastructure. And the reason that we've decided to pick a winner there is that we want a service that will create traction, that will create a customer response and get people used to using it. And my understanding is fast payments in the UK, it was a bit like Kevin Costner in Fields of Dream. They built it, and in the first little while, nobody turned up. So our first overlay is designed to make it become very much part of people's thinking and to get it used. So my next diagram doesn't have the rugby union manager's playbook that Chris's did, but it describes in the centre that mutual clearing utility, which for a better name at the minute we're calling NPP Australia. That infrastructure has three major mechanisms. It needs to drive a network, it needs to have switching capability, it needs to provide an addressing service. The ADIs and their service providers will become members of the clearing utility. The RBA, obviously on the left, needs to settle. The overlay services over there on the right, and overlooking from a policy oversight perspective, is the Payment System Board. So in very simple terms, that is probably the key difference when I spoke about before about our approach and other approaches around the world. Other approaches maybe at times have tried to build overlay services in the infrastructure. We've made a very clear delineation between both of those aspects. Now, who's in? These are the 17 organisations that committed to fund where we are up to date, and that funding by any stretch of the imagination has not been immaterial. So we have the major banks there. We have a number of service providers such as ASL and Cuscal and Inju. We have foreign banks such as Citi and ING and HSBC and Bank America. We've got regional banks like Bendigo and Suncorp, BOQ and Macquarie. And we have PayPal. So there's 17 there, but you'll see there's room at the bottom of that slide because over time we might have an expectation that others will want to become direct participants in this game. So where are we? We're in the final stages of sourcing the vendors for the basic infrastructure in that initial convenience service. Secondly, we're considering, the participants are considering their participation and connection options, which means writing a cheque. Now, we need to do two before we get to one, but we're very close. So I say with at least some degree of confidence that we're a matter of weeks away of being A, able to say yes, we have the participation levels necessary, and B, we have now signed a contract with the winning tenderer and be able to announce who that is. But we can't do the tenderer before we actually get the money to be able to sign the contract. Thirdly, the PMSO, and it's probably a point I should have made earlier, that's the Program Management Support Office, and I think a critical success factor in the way we've gone to date is that we retain the services of KPMG at an early stage, and they provide that facility, along with the arms and legs of APCA, to make, I think, what's turning out to be a very effective project. So down the bottom there, it says we are here, August 14. We're probably a month or two behind in that regard, but we're about to move into a 6-month aspect of design and elaborate with the winning tenderer. We'll then move into building the infrastructure. Then there is a significant period of time for testing because the industry itself needs to make sure that it's capable of doing what we want it to do and what they want it to do. And our overall target is sometime late 16, first quarter 17. So things for ADIs in Australia to think about, obviously connecting to the business, the basic infrastructure is a critical one. Secondly, to manage the sub-accounted fast settlement services at the RBA. To have processes and technology able to handle real-time customer account management. And lastly, an ability to think about the initial convenience service. And over on the right, in terms of opportunities, online, mobile banking integration, app world, And we feel there's going to be a lot of potential in what we're calling specialised verticals and things like superannuation, the extension into superannuation, into reinsurance, into logistics, into transport. So I spoke earlier about what's happening internationally. There's a whole lot of studies around about real-time payments internationally, but for the sake of today, I've chosen a study called Flavours of Fast, a trip around the world in immediate payments by the Clear to Pay organisation. They define fast payment system as a domestic interbank purely electronic payment infrastructure into which irrevocable funds are transferred from one bank account to another and where confirmation back to the originator and receiver of the payment is available in 1 minute or less. We're working to a far higher tolerance than 1 minute or less, but it's a workable definition. So what they then did is look at faster payment systems around the world, and the pinky colour is the thing they say is absolutely non-negotiable, irrevocable, less than a minute end-to-end, account-to-account and interbank. The blue category is those things they call highly desirable, universal access using an ISO standard and 24/7 times 365 days a year. And the green are what they're calling optional features, which in this case are extended B2B remittance, alternate identifier, batch and individual payments and fast settlement. And the rating system down the bottom, for some arcane and convoluted thinking, they gave a rating of 5 chilies if you're world's best practice, because they think fast payments is hot and spicy, and I can't follow that logic, but that's their definition. So what they then did is rate all of those fast payment systems around the world. You can see most of them are 3, some are 4. They didn't rate us because we haven't built it yet, but on the basis of what we said we're going to do, they've given us a 5 chili rating, which is pretty good, but the proof will be in the pudding. Okay, what I'd like to do now is just describe some of the lessons that I've learnt, and I'll ask Chris to come up and join for the questions. Maybe he's got some others. The first lesson we learnt was that if you're going to undertake a program of this nature, structure and process is absolutely critical. So at various times, the steering committee probably had 4 or 5 different working parties working with it that were staffed by people from APCA and KPMG, but also from the 17 participants. So it was a heavily structured process, and the program disciplines and project management disciplines in there, from my perspective, and I've looked at a lot of projects over time, are world's best practice. So structure and a good idea isn't just going to solve itself. It needs structure, process and commitment. Secondly, take the time. We've given ourselves a 3-year time. At the same time, don't give yourself too much time. So within the 13 months that I've been chairing the steering committee, we've had 22 steering committee meetings. And often we'll have a couple a month. And the reason for that is momentum is critical in a project of this type. If you leave too much time, you get distraction. And once organisations get distracted, it's hard to get their minds back on the main game again. Thirdly, invest the resources, not only into the centre, but the 17 organisations that have been part of this exercise. I've been amazed how much commitment and their staff they've given. For example, we got 6 tenderers for the basic infrastructure down to 3, and those 3 had a day to present their wares to a broad group of people from the industry, 1 day each for each of the 3. And in the room where that analysis and evaluation was taking place, I don't think at any one time, Chris, there would have been less than about 50 people there, 50 or 60, and occasionally 80. Now, these are people with day jobs, but their organisation said this is so important to pick the right tenderer that we're willing to commit that level of resource. The fourth point I've got there is have the hard conversations early. And those usually relate in the experience of the NPP around the definition and planning phase and about governance and leadership. Fifth point I've got there is utilise opportunities. In our case, it was the interest of the RBA. And again, I go back to Glenn Stevens' speech at a recent APCA function. He said, again I quote, "Delivering the NPP is, in my opinion, in the interests of Australian financial institutions, which are at the heart of payments today. It can be expected to lead to further growth in electronic payments and a reduction in costs. It will maintain the ongoing relevance of the current players." And here's the sting in the tail. "If those players do not provide Australian end users with the services they want, surely others will seek to do so. Alternatively, the Reserve Bank would be duty-bound to consider a regulatory approach, quote unquote. My final point is that this is a massive exercise in collaborative endeavour. And what we've had are people giving up a little bit of commercial self-interest for the broader good. And I've been amazed just how well that has flown through. And I'm reminded of a quote by ex-President Bill Clinton, who said, "We know that networks of cooperation work better than geniuses working alone." And I think NPP is a classic example of that. So, I'm a little bit over, but in summary, number of points. We are building this and delivering this for Australia. Not for any one organisation, we're building it for the national good. Secondly, we're building it for the whole industry. It's not a closed shop. It will be open and accessible to all that want to play the game as long as they meet certain standards. Thirdly, the commitment and interest has been incredibly strong. Fourthly, we've tried to avoid too much complexity, particularly in the basic infrastructure, and we've tried to keep it very simple. Fifthly, we're focused on the long run, not next week, not next month, next year, but 10 to 15 years down the track. And sixthly, by and large, we're running to schedule. So, ladies and gentlemen, I really appreciate being part of your conference. More than happy to take any questions. Thank you.
We are running a little bit over time. We've got a moment for one quick question for Paul, if anyone has one. One very quick question from the floor down the back there.
Chris, do you want to come?
I'm just thinking on, can you handle the New Zealand dollar through your new system?
I thought that question might have come as well. That's an issue we haven't looked at this stage. Let us build it first and get it up and running, and that might be the time that we could start thinking about that. Chris?
Yeah, so in principle, yes, not spec'd for day one. And indeed, to do that, what you would need to do is build the connectivity to the settlement system here, to the Reserve Bank settlement infrastructure here, and we haven't obviously even started thinking about that issue. So, but in principle, that could be done.
There may be another caveat, which is that we get this closer economic relations to a time where there's just one currency.
Well, that's always a possibility, but not one we need to talk about right now.
We're going to adopt the
Or
New
we can
Zealand
go
dollar,
back and
aren't we?
talk about the Bledisloe Cup, I guess, as the alternative. Look, we do need to keep the time to make sure we get through all the other speakers. They've been tremendous presentations, guys. Very valuable information, so thanks so much.
Pleasure. Thanks, Steve.